So thank you all for being here. So this project is joined with Elsa Boites, who's currently at Meta. I am Diego, and thank you to the organizers for including our paper in this amazing conference. Broadly, the paper is motivated by the fact that we now have a robust literature documenting the persistence of history. So we know that history matters, and there is a related literature showing that bringing history to mind, activating history, can also affect political behavior. So not only does history matter, but how we think and speak about history seems to matter as well. And yet there is little evidence on how people in the US think and speak about the history of their own country and whether that matters for political behavior. So that is what we hope to address in this paper, first by answering the question, how do people think and speak about the history of the US? And in this paper, we will focus on an important first step, which is understanding views and narratives surrounding the history of race. So to that end, we surveyed approximately 14,000 respondents and in the US, and we inquired about their views on the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and slavery's ongoing legacy. And the first part of the paper will focus on understanding variations in how people think and speak about the history of race, particularly about these episodes. In the second part of the paper, we move into the realms of experimental evidence to examine whether activating the history of race can affect political behavior. And we will focus on effects pertaining to institutional satisfaction. Why institutional satisfaction? Because in the end, narratives about the history of race in the US are intertwined with narratives about the extent to which the institutions of the US were successful at managing and navigating this tension. So we anticipated an effect on institutional satisfaction. This is, of course, something that we registered with one added layer of nuance that stemmed from the possibility that liberals and conservatives may think and speak about the history of race quite differently. And if so, effects could vary by ideology. In the end, we embedded two experiments in our surveys, essentially two different priming experiments, to shed light from different angles whether or not activating the history of race can exacerbate polarization and institutional satisfaction. And of course, I'll provide more details about these experiments in a couple of slides. Before that, let me just highlight a couple of findings. We uncover important variations in how different demographic groups think and speak about the history of race. Unexpectedly, race does not show up in a consistent way. So race matters, but how it matters actually varies quite a lot depending on the specific historical issue under scrutiny. What does seem to be pervasive is ideology. Regardless of how we cut the data, whether we focus on African Americans or white respondents, and regardless of the historical episode under scrutiny, we will find pervasive ideological differences. Now, I'll just emphasize one dimension of difference, which is that conservative historical narratives tend to emphasize the role of individuals and individual agency, whereas progressive historical narratives tend to emphasize the role of structures that existed in the past and that continue to exist in some shape or form today. In terms of the experiments, both experiments will point at a polarizing role of activating the history of race. We're particularly well powered to estimate these effects for white respondents. That is not to say that we find no evidence among Black respondents. The averages, even among Black respondents, indeed move towards polarization, but sadly we're underpowered to estimate this effect because it turns out that surveying a large sample of Black conservatives is really, really hard. So at the very least, the averages move in the same direction, and then for white respondents, we do get to precisely estimate these effects. Interestingly, the polarization that we find is asymmetrical. So to begin with, conservatives exhibit a higher satisfaction with institutions than liberals. Because of our interventions, the ideological gap increases, but it increases not because anything happens with conservatives. Conservatives actually don't care, but mostly because liberals report an even lower institutional satisfaction, right? So it is all coming from liberals. And in terms of mechanisms, I will provide suggested evidence that negative affectivity seems to play a role. Activating the history of race seems to induce negative emotions, particularly disillusionment among liberals, more so than among conservatives, and this can naturally bias the way in which they feel towards their institutions, the disillusionment that they feel towards their institutions. I'm going to rush through the contributions, but basically there is a literature that you're all familiar with on narratives, how and when they matter. Our contribution is shedding light on an important type of narrative, historical narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about the history of our region or of our country. A literature about activated history, episodes or interventions that bring history to mind and in so doing foster specific types of behavior. Our contribution here is showing that historical remembrance may induce different and even opposing behaviors for different subgroups of the population. Third, a literature on large-scale surveys to study how people think about various phenomena. And our contribution is not only adding another item to the list of topics, but providing a framework that can be easily adjusted by future researchers interested in studying how people in their context of interest think and speak about their own history. And finally, a set of papers studying the drivers of polarization, particularly in the US. And in our contribution here is providing empirical evidence in support of activating the issue of race as another potential source of polarization in the country. So this is the outline of the talk. Let me pause for a second to see if there are questions. Yes, please.
Do you think the result is like? I understand. And a lot of it is because of described, which is the conservatives. We're going to cut through the grabbing racist, It's liberalism, like, yes, we have.
Yeah, so this is an impression that I get when I present the paper. It may be the case because of how we measured institutional satisfaction. So let me get to that in a second. It may also be the case that, I mean, Democrats have a tendency towards sort of improving their institutions towards something substantially more democratic, but they are dissatisfied with how democratic the institutions are. So that may be showing up in how we measure institutional satisfaction. But let me go over the results and we can then revisit this conversation later. All right, so let me start with a discussion about the data. So in 2022, we conducted approximately 14,000 surveys online with the assistance of 3 platforms, Lucid, Dynata, and Prolific. These platforms have been widely used in social sciences and economics, and they ensure being capable of reaching a wide representative audience. We went with the 3 just to diversify, to mitigate the risk of learning about a glitch with one of them exposed. That ultimately allowed us to survey slightly more than 10,000 white respondents and slightly less than 4,000 Black respondents. Our goal to begin with was having 50-50 quotas by ideology. We wanted to test a polarization result. Very quickly, we learned that it was not going to be possible to survey a large sample of Black conservatives. So in the end, we went with 50-50 quotas by ideology for white respondents, and for Black respondents, our goal was matching the average characteristics per census data. How did we go about eliciting views and narratives? There are, of course, many ways we could have implemented. We piloted several, and this one seemed to work best. So for each historical episode that we were interested in, we showed our participants a given claim. We asked our participants to express their agreement or disagreement with the claim, and then immediately after, through an open-ended response, we asked participants to elaborate on their views pertaining to the claim and to the episode more generally. Right, so that gives us both categorical information, but also open-ended responses. The 3 claims and corresponding open-ended responses that we included in our surveys were as follows. First, slavery caused a civil war. Second, the goals of the civil rights movement have been fulfilled. And third, there is an ongoing legacy from slavery. Again, for each of these, participants expressed their agreement or disagreement and provided an open-ended response, elaborating on their views. When it comes to the dependent variable in the experimental portion of the paper, in the experiments, we will focus on effects pertaining to institutional satisfaction. And the way in which we measure this is through 3 survey questions: support for democracy, support for capitalism, and support for the institutional setup in the US. And then we constructed a summary index with these 3 variables to get at the underlying tendency to feeling satisfied with the institutional setup in the US writ large, in a broad sense. And now I got to tell you a little bit more about the experiment. So we embedded 2 experiments in our surveys. Participants were enrolled in either experiment 1 or experiment 2. Each experiment was stratified by race and ideology, and the goal was basically tackling from different angles whether activating the history of race, bringing the history of race to mind, can exacerbate polarization in institutional satisfaction. The first experiment, the simple experiment of just an order or randomizing the order of the survey, so that half of our participants were randomly assigned to answer the question one way and the other half another way. Specifically, a treatment group will be those who answered historical questions before answering questions about the institution, so they're already thinking about the history of race, and a control group basically providing institutional satisfaction without being prompted to think about the history of race. And this is just going to be very high-level first-pass evidence as to whether or not bringing the history of race to mind has any effect on institutional satisfaction. Of course, alone, this experiment will tell us nothing of what's happening exactly in the minds of our participants, just high-level evidence. That is part of the reason why we implemented the second experiment, in which we wanted to go a step further and actually examine if exposure to a specific historical content can exacerbate polarization. So we designed different kinds of historical narratives. Specifically, we designed a liberal historical narrative representative of the views of liberals. We designed a conservative historical narrative representative of the views of conservatives. And experiment 2 boils down to randomly assigning participants to one of these or to no narrative, with the goal of examining if, relative to the red no narrative, exposure to either content can exacerbate polarization, right? And I'll go over the details of how we constructed these representative narratives. I may run out of time, so let me just highlight 2 things. First, we actually used the open-ended responses from the first couple of thousand respondents that we surveyed to construct these narratives. So these are indeed narratives based on how people actually speak about these episodes. And before launching experiment 2, we made sure to validate these narratives. We surveyed a group of liberals, showed them the liberal narrative, and asked them if they agreed with it. And more than 90% of liberals agreed with their narrative, and similarly for the conservative narrative. So this is an actual experiment that allows us to see if exposure to a content that indeed resonates with those that are supposed to represent by ideology, if that can exacerbate polarization. And then just a word about the sample. So what you see here is a comparison between different groups of our participants and their counterpart in what would be a representative survey. So columns 1 and 2 compare white liberals in our sample with white liberals in the American National Election Studies, a representative survey. Columns 3 and 4 go through the same comparison, but now for white conservatives. And columns 5 and 6 compare Black respondents with African Americans in the American Community Survey, basically to give us an idea whether our data for African Americans align with census data, because we were not targeting ideological quotas there. Now, crucially, I want to highlight a couple of things. First, when it comes to white liberals, it doesn't seem to be the case that our sample of white liberals is all that different from white liberals that you would encounter in a representative sample. But as you may have noticed already, that is not the case for white conservatives and for Black respondents. For white conservatives and Black respondents, we noticed that we slightly accidentally oversampled educated respondents, right? College degree attainment is slightly more likely among our sample of white conservatives and also among our sample of African Americans. Now, this adds to the many ways, unobservable ways in which our data could differ from the representative sample because we surveyed participants online. So this is something that I wanted to be fully transparent about. Of course, I'll show you some robust checks that we believe provide reassuring evidence that we're capturing meaningful, broader trends nonetheless, but this is at the very least something that I wanted to fully disclose. Yes?
Can you also condition on
Intensity of beliefs measured.
well, because like you're basically have a binary test. There's some also some distribution.
Let me show you what I have, because one of the bulk of the results I'll be showing you are basically descriptive. And there I don't believe I have a measure of intensity. Maybe I have a measure of intensity of the emotions that participants go through when discussing this. But let me show you what I have, and then you can tell me how I can improve those results. By all means, for sure. Many ways to improve. All right, so let me start with an analysis of how different cohorts reacted to the claims that we included in our surveys. And we can do that for each race. So what you see here, each dot corresponds to the percentage of participants from the same cohort and race that agrees with the claim described on the y-axis. Here we have agreement with the claim that slavery caused the Civil War. In blue, you have the trends for African Americans across cohorts, and in red for white respondents. And we notice a couple of things. First, if you're familiar with US politics, there are popular claims emphasizing how certain demographic groups deny or downplay the role of slavery as a cause of the Civil War. That seems to be at odds with our data, right? The majority of respondents, regardless of cohort and regardless of race, agrees with the claim that slavery caused the Civil War. And we will see these again, even when we zoom in on white conservatives who don't have a college degree. Even among those respondents, we find that the majority agrees with the claim that slavery caused the Civil War.
Sorry, what year did you do this?
The survey 2022. Yeah. Second thing to note, when we focus on racial gaps, notice that among all the respondents, there are no meaningful racial differences on what was the cause of the Civil War. And in fact, when we turn to younger respondents, we do notice the emergence of a racial divide on what was the cause of the Civil War. And this is very, very different than the patterns that we come across when we focus on other historical episodes. For instance, when we turn to agreement with the claim that the civil rights movement was a success, notice that for this issue, among all the respondents, there is quite a noticeable racial gap that disappears altogether when we turn to younger respondents. So a completely different set of trends. And when we now turn to whether or not slavery continues to matter, again, completely different set of trends here. Racial differences are quite stable across cohort, with African Americans oscillating around 85% and white respondents around 50% in the extent to which they agree with the claim that slavery continues to matter. Yes.
I mean, your far side is all driven by younger blacks becoming more
Optimistic.
more optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, the whites are barely changing. It's
There-
blacks by age.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there is some
I just think-
degree, but it's very mild. Yes, it is mostly African Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, though, it seems like whites are the ones who are drifting apart from African Americans. Now, before moving on, just a word about external validity. So fortunately, this last question, agreement with the claim that slavery continues to matter, was included in the American National Election Studies, a representative survey, which allows us to see if the patterns that emerge based on a representative survey align with what we see in our data. Unfortunately, we can only do this for white respondents because it turns out that the American National Election Studies is quite limited when it comes to sample size of African Americans. So the best that we can do is white respondents, but at the very least, that it seems like our patterns align almost perfectly with what you would get in a representative survey. And then we can explicitly account for the observable ways in which our data differ from a representative sample, namely education. We can reweight by education, which is what you see here in purple and orange. Notice the patterns are virtually the same. So to the extent that we can check, yes, there are some dimensions of difference between our data and what would be a representative sample, but it seems like we are capturing meaningful broader trends in the US. Now, I did mention earlier that ideology seems to be pervasive, so let me now turn to ideology. When we start to focus on ideology, we'll notice that it shows up again and again and again in a consistent way. So focusing on whether slavery caused the Civil War, notice if we focus on Black respondents or white respondents, liberals are more likely than conservatives to agree with this claim. Turning to the civil rights movement, regardless of race, liberals are less likely than conservatives to agree with this claim. And then when it comes to slavery's legacy, the existence of a legacy, regardless of the focus group that one may focus on, liberals are more likely than conservatives to agree with the existence of such legacy. Of course, you may have noticed immediately the magnitude of the ideological gap varies in interesting ways by race. That's certainly the case. So if you first focus on the last two bars, ideological differences among African Americans, notice that among African Americans, the ideological gap is quite stable. It is always around the ballpark of 10 percentage points, right? Whereas among white respondents, we notice that the gap grows and grows. It becomes more and more salient the closer in time we are to the present. So it is also around 10 percentage points when we focus on whether slavery caused the Civil War or not. The ideological gap grows to almost 40 percentage points when we turn to the civil rights movement 60 years ago. But now when we explicitly link the past and the present, right, asking whether slavery continues to affect today's outcomes, the ideological gap exceeds 50 percentage points. So it is more and more salient among white respondents the closer in time we are to the present. Speaking about times, how am I doing with that?
So you have, no, you have 20.
20. Okay, that's good. Good. So more interesting, yes, please.
Just to understand these factual questions, like, do you have any idea whether the respondents think this is a positive or a negative thing? I mean, kind of, there is still kind of a legacy of slavery. Yeah, and that's a good thing, or no, this is terrible. Right?
That's, yeah, I could examine that more explicitly. I'll show you something that indirectly speaks to that in a minute. But this is something I could examine more explicitly with the data that I have. Because I do have open-ended responses, which is what I'll turn to now. Because more interesting than whether they agreed or not with different claims is how they speak about these episodes. So let me turn to an analysis of these open-ended responses, starting with the narratives that different demographic groups rely on. So to that end, I'll build on the work by both Falk and Tirole, who typify two important types of narratives. On the one hand, exculpating narratives, which are narratives that provide excuses that legitimize short-sighted, selfish behavior in the context of historical racial narratives. These narratives essentially would provide excuses for the inequities across race in the past. On the other hand, we have responsabilizing narratives, which are narratives that are actively imposing a sense of moral responsibility. So in the context of historical racial narratives, these narratives would discuss racial inequities of the past in a way that is imposing a sense of moral duty to the receiving end of the narrative. So with the assistance of a team of 5 RAs, we coded all of the open-ended responses and created 2 indicator variables, one for exculpating narratives, one for response-realizing narratives, and I'll just emphasize that both indicators could be 1 or both could be 0 or something in between. When we look at the prevalence of these narratives, we notice 2 striking things. First, exculpating narratives seem to be clearly a white conservative phenomenon. Nearly 70% of the narratives from white conservatives are structured in a way that they are actively providing excuses for the wrongdoings of the past. And this is nowhere near as relevant among other demographic groups. On the other hand, when we turn to these narratives that impose a sense of moral responsibility, we notice that there are no meaningful differences between white liberals, and black conservatives. And it is really white conservatives, the ones who stand out as relying to a lower extent on these narratives that impose a sense of moral responsibility. You may wonder, what's the role of having like hand-coded all of these? We could actually use an LLM, right? Well, we can, and we did, and the patterns are different in terms of the base level, but the differences across demographic groups are very, very in line with what our hand coders did, right? White conservatives, by and large, are the ones relying on exculpating narratives. There are no differences between black liberals, black conservatives, and white liberals. And it is white conservatives, the ones who avoid imposing a sense of moral responsibility. Yes.
What's the third option here? Like, is it like either of the 2? Because I guess when you.
No, there's no third option. It's 2 indicator variables. Both indicators could be 1, both indicators could be 0.
Okay.
They're not mutually exclusive. You could have an open-ended response in which at first they're actually providing excuses, and then by the very end, they're actually imposing a sense of moral responsibility. These are organic responses, not academic ones.
Honestly, because the GPT coding also looks like it's actually like complementary, like the past 7
To some extent.
Maybe some.
To some extent, but they are not they're necessarily. We do have several respondents who use both or neither. Another interesting issue that we wanted to examine is the prevalence of a first-person point of view, usage of we, our, us, I, because that signals that the history of race feels more personal to the respondent, right? The respondent is trying to include themselves as a participant in the history of race. When we look at that, we notice that the prevalence of the first-person point of view follows ideological lines, again, with liberals being more likely to discuss the history of race based on a first-person point of view than conservatives. And then this part, which I really like, and I think it's important, which is asking ourselves, how do participants discuss or account for historical social change? And this is just a convoluted way of asking ourselves, when participants discuss the history of race, are they emphasizing the role of individuals and individual agency? And this is what sociologists would call methodological individualism, an emphasis on individual choice when accounting for social change, when trying to explain what's happening? Or is it the case that participants emphasize the role of structures? Structures being these macro systems to which everyone and everything is connected, and these systems ultimately constrain individual choice. So is it the case that participants emphasize individuals and or they emphasize structures, and emphasis here on and or, because again, these are organic, not academic responses. You could have an individual who emphasizes both or neither. So again, we coded these variables, created 2 indicator variables to see the prevalence of these understandings of how historical change comes about. And again, we find clear ideological patterns, liberals being more likely to emphasize structures when discussing the history of race, and conservatives being more likely to emphasize the role of individual and individual agency. Again, white conservatives being slightly different, be it because they are avoiding structural explanations or because they are more often than not emphasizing individuals. And then this gets to your point. So just 1 second, let me go through this, and this gets to your point indirectly, perhaps not perfectly, and we can discuss later how can I improve this. But one last thing before moving on to the experiments pertains to the tone and the emotions that our participants were conveying when they were asked to discuss the history of race. And there are different ways of getting at this. One is looking at a sentiment analysis. I'm sure you're all familiar with a sentiment analysis, very raw evidence as to whether the tone is negative or positive. Another one, slightly more involved, the end result is very similar, which is labeling the emotions that are featured in a given open-ended response. Some emotions will be negative, some will be positive. If negative emotions feature more prominently, we would call the open-ended response predominantly negative. Regardless of how we look at the emotion and the tone, we find clear patterns. First, everyone, regardless of race and ideology, tends to be quite pessimistic about discussions around the history of race. Everyone, even white conservatives, right? But number two, this seems to be more pronounced among liberals than among conservatives, right? And the fact that we find a strong negative sentiment or tone across the board aligned with what has been documented in other places, for instance, in Chile or in Ireland with the trouble, when you ask people to discuss painful, traumatic historical episodes. So this is in line with that. But it seems that for liberals, the history of race it's not only that they feel that it's more personal, but they actually are more likely to go through negative emotion. Yes.
I was just curious, I don't think this is like, so by the way, so when you show those are not just exam.
These are sample means.
So not,
These are sample means, yeah.
all right, well, no, so I'm just curious about the role.
Interestingly, education doesn't seem to be all that relevant. I don't have it for this line, but when we look at education, let me briefly show you, I don't know, whatever you want to look at. When we look at education, the patterns are very in line, even when we focus on non-college educated participants.
So I think the question is more like, well, so if you think about like the types of sort of I guess some lower quality institutions.
It could very well be the case, but interestingly, when we look at the source of the narratives, institutional knowledge doesn't seem to be that relevant. When we try to account for differences across groups, what does seem to be relevant is whether people report learning what they are sharing from their parents or not. But I unfortunately don't have that slide here, but we can talk later about the role of institutional knowledge. All right, so how long do I have?
11.
11 minutes? Oh, perfect. Great. So let me now turn to the experimental portion of the paper, which, as I previewed, is meant to examine from different angles whether activating the history of race can exacerbate polarization in institutional satisfaction. And I'll start with experiment 1, a very simple order experiment in which we randomized the order of the survey. The treatment group are those assigned to answering the historical questions before answering the institutional questions. So they are thinking about the history of race. The control are those who answered questions about the institutions without being prompted, right? And we want to see whether the order, specifically having answered the historical question before, matters for the institutional satisfaction reported. Our key variable, dependent variable, will be this index of institutional satisfaction that I described. We're interested in examining differences by ideology, and we will focus on white respondents because we're underpowered when it comes to black respondents. I'll show you briefly what we find for black respondents. So these are the results from experiment 1. If you focus on conservatives, whether or not they answer the historical question before, they actually report a very similar institutional satisfaction. So being prompted to think about the history of race doesn't seem to matter for conservatives. But for liberals, those who were prompted to think about the history of race report a significantly lower institutional satisfaction than those who were not. So in the end, let me just make the point. In the end, when you focus on those who are thinking about the history of race, you do come across a stronger polarization, but that's coming exclusively from liberals. Yes.
Can you just remind us what exactly is institutional satisfaction?
Yes, so it's a measure that combines satisfaction with democracy, with capitalism, and basically with the system of courts.
And yeah, that's what I thought it was. And I think among the three, capitalism is really quite different and very different from conservatives and liberals. And this might go back to what you were asking before about like sort of exact. So yeah, it would be nice to see.
Very likely the case, but notice that the one dimension for which perhaps we find, so here I don't have whether results are significant, but they are significant for these two, preserving the institutional setup in the US, support for democracy. For capitalism, we do find a very slight decrease among liberals, but nothing as relevant.
So conservatives don't move on any of them. That's interesting.
Conservatives don't care about thinking about the history of race. It doesn't matter. And that's something that we find also in experiment 2. All right, of course, what's happening here is something that experiment 1 alone cannot answer, right? It can be the case that liberals immediately are prompted to think about politically contentious topics at the moment. That could be it. Or they are prompted to think about how conservatives misbehave. And this could be just a reflection of effective polarization. So that is the reason why we implemented experiment 2, in which we wanted to see if it is really about the historical contents that participants think of, all right? To that end, we constructed a liberal historical narrative representative of the views of liberals a conservative historical narrative representative of the views of conservatives. And experiment 2 boils down to randomly assigning participants to reading one of these or no narrative, right? With the goal of examining if either content exacerbates polarizations. Let me briefly show you. Oh, here it is. The treatment arm. So those assigned to the conservative treatment arm read this text right here. I'm not going to read it in the interest of time, but if you do briefly skim through it, you'll notice several things that resonate quite strongly with what I said earlier, right? In this narrative, you'll find that it is claimed that the civil rights movement was a success, that slavery doesn't matter anymore. There's an emphasis on one's abilities and willingness, or an emphasis on individuals, right? And there are even elements of exculpating narrative, right? So at some point it mentions that the US is basically one place out of a bunch of places where slavery was present, and that if anything, the US is exceptional in how slavery was dealt. Clear elements of exculpating narrative. So this really captures vividly what we saw for conservatives. And those assigned to the liberal historical narrative treatment were asked to read this paragraph that you see here. Again, I won't read it in detail, but you'll see that most of the themes that I have been describing thus far show up vividly in these texts as well, right? So this is essentially the experiment being assigned to reading the conservative narrative or the liberal one. Again, I would like to emphasize that more than 90% of liberals that we show the narrative agreed with the liberal narrative, and similarly with conservatives. So these texts indeed resonate with those that they were supposed to represent. I am running out of time, so I can't go through the detail of how we constructed the narrative. But in the interest of the topic of the conference, I'll just emphasize that it is a multi-layered process that involves a deep learning model that uses all of the open-ended responses from the first couple of thousand people who were surveyed. We actually refined the output of that with an LLM. And then before launching the experiments, we validated the narratives with both focus groups and with a full-scale survey to actually see if the narratives resonated. And they did, fortunately. Now, the dependent variable is going to be, again, this index of institutional satisfaction, all right? And we will focus, again, only on, let me briefly show you what we saw. No, this is not the way in which you should present. Let me show you black respondents by the end if I have time. Again, we will focus only on white respondents because we are underpowered when it comes to black respondents. All right, so these are the results, and you'll notice that the patterns align nicely with what we saw in experiment 1. Conservatives, whether they read one narrative or the other, whether they read no narrative, they actually report a very stable institutional satisfaction. Perhaps if we had a larger sample size, conservatives assigned to the conservative narrative would have reported a significantly higher institutional satisfaction, but it is really, really stable. On the other hand, liberals, we find something quite interesting. Liberals exposed to the conservative historical narrative actually don't react, right? So exposure to how conservatives think about history doesn't seem to matter, which immediately disproves stories about experiment 1 as coming from political associations with contentious topics of the moment, right? Because if those associations were at the heart of experiment 1, then explicitly showing liberals how conservatives think should lead to those associations. It's also not about affective polarization, because here we're explicitly telling liberals, look, this is how conservatives think. And that's not really just that doesn't seem to matter. What seems to matter is liberals who are exposed to their own historical views and notions. When we expose them to how their fellow liberals think, we come across the same result that we saw in experiment 1, namely a substantial decrease in institutional satisfaction. So there's something about the liberal historical content that when you show that to liberals, they are immediately persuaded into reporting a low institutional satisfaction. What is it about the contents? Before showing you, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious because your treatment is kind of like a compound treatment of the views on race and like meritocracy and everything. So I'm curious what would happen to the liberals reading the conservative narrative if only was related to race.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, with the design that I have, I would have to split the narrative into several components. The short answer is these issues are confounded in actual narratives that people discuss organically, right? When conservatives discuss the history of race, they confound both issues, and likewise with liberals. So let me now turn to mechanisms, and with that I'll close. What is it about liberal historical narratives that leads fellow liberals to reporting lower institutional satisfaction? Well, in the paper, we show that it may be at least partially explained by the emotions that these narratives induce. So we elicited how participants were feeling at their response to the survey. We literally just asked them, share with us how you're feeling now, right? And the responses were not really constrained. They could actually share an array of emotions. And then when we look at negative emotions, particularly disillusionment, we find a pattern that aligns almost perfectly with what we saw in experiment 1 and experiment 2. If you look at disillusionment, so there's an indicator that equals 1 if the participant reports disillusionment. To begin with, conservatives express a low tendency towards disillusionment, and whether or not they are thinking about the history of race doesn't matter in terms of their disillusionment. On the other hand, when it turns to liberals, liberals are, to begin with, even before being prompted to think about the history of race, they are more likely to feel disillusioned. But then when we activate the history of race, they experience a substantial increase in the likelihood of reporting disillusionment, right? And this really aligns, this asymmetrical pattern aligns quite nicely with what we saw in experiments 1 and 2. So I think, yes, please.
On your previous slide, I'm very curious about this box. Motivated reasoning is not an intervening mechanism.
Yes. So the first mechanism that I thought about when I was designing the protocol was motivated reasoning, right? You ask liberals to speak about the history of race. They are convinced that the US is horrible, and then they are more prone to actually reporting that the institutions don't work. And similarly for conservatives. So one way of examining this is looking at, you actually show different claims to the participants. You don't tell them if the beliefs are, if the claims are true or not, and you simply ask them how likely are the claims to be true, right? And you have a redeeming claim, basically something that works very nicely for racial gaps in the history of the race in the US, and a damning claim, right? If motivated reasoning was at play here, you should observe liberals, after being prompted to think about the history of race, increase the likelihood of the damning claim being true. Right? And that's not what we see. And you can measure this in a different way, which is looking at claims that we explicitly tell participants that are true. So we show participants a couple of claims that we tell them these claims are true, but we ask them how relevant are these facts, right? And again, liberals, whether or not we activate the history of race, are equally likely to claim that a claim is relevant if it is negative as if it is positive. So it's not motivated reasoning. I expected this to be the main mechanism, but as it turns out with research, you all know things don't work out as you expected. All right. And basically, that is it. The main contribution of the paper, I will say, is simply documenting how different demographic groups think and speak about the history of race. I understand that this is just a small portion of US history writ large, but we think that this is particularly important. And not only interesting, but important in as much as when we look at our experiments, it seems like this is a source of polarization, potentially an important one as well. Thanks.